March 6, 1944, 23,000 feet over the black forests of central Germany. The air at this altitude is a crystalline, deadly cold, thin enough to starve engines and men. Inside the shuddering aluminum skin of a B-17 flying fortress named Hell's Fury, the world is a roar of wind and machinery. The scent of high-octane fuel, hot oil, and ozone is thick. In the tail gun position, the most isolated, most exposed spot on the aircraft, Staff Sergeant Michael, Mad Mike. Donovan feels every vibration through the freezing metal of his seat. He is alone in a plexiglass bubble, the bomber's 9 other crew members just voices on the intercom ahead of him. His world is framed by the twin 50 caliber Browning M12 machine guns he grips, their breeches cold even through his electrically heated gloves. Below his boots, a flimsy-looking hatch is the only exit, a 6-mile drop to enemy territory. This is the position with the highest casualty rate in the 8th Air Force. 38% don't finish their tour. The previous tail gunner, Sergeant Eddie Morrison, survived 3 missions here before requesting a transfer, calling the spot cursed. Donovan volunteered for it immediately. Now he scans a vast, empty sky of brilliant blue. It's deceptively peaceful. Then, a flicker of movement, tiny specks condensing out of the glare to the east. Donovan's eyes, sharpened by a South Boston childhood of watching for threats, don't just see them. He counts them, analyzes them. 12 specks, growing, resolving into the distinctive, shark-like silhouettes of Messerschmitt Bf 109s. They're forming up into a swarm, a lethal hunting pack, positioning for a classic stern attack. They are 2,000 yards out and closing. Standard procedure crackles in his mind, drilled in through months of training at gunnery school. Conserve ammunition. Wait until they commit to their attack run. Let them enter your optimal firing range of 600 yards. Fire defensively, short bursts aimed at the lead fighter. Common sense, the survival instinct of every man in a bomber, screams a simpler directive: stay alive. Donovan's hands tighten on the triggers. His breathing steadies. He is not thinking of procedure or common sense. He is thinking of the 32 street fights of his youth, the 4 he lost because he waited, because he reacted. He is remembering the gunnery instructor who called him too aggressive, too reckless. He hears his own response, the one that became legend in the barracks: dead gunners don't shoot back. Live ones do. The German fighters tighten their formation. The lead aircraft tips its wings, beginning the orchestrated dance of death. They are 18-0 yards out, then 1,500. Donovan does not wait. He does not retreat into the mental bunker of defense. His thumbs press the triggers. The violent, jackhammer concussion of the twin 50 cals shatters the relative quiet. Tracer rounds, 1 in every 5 bullets, a bright streak of flame, arc across the mile of empty sky. At this extreme range, the probability of a hit is near 0. The rounds fall short or streak harmlessly past the formation. To his crew, to any observer, it is a wasteful, reckless, even panicked burst. But in the cockpits of those 12 Bf 109s, seasoned Luftwaffe pilots see something different. They see unexpected, aggressive fire. Their disciplined formation wavers for a split second. The lead fighter's smooth approach falters. The attack pattern, not yet fully launched, experiences its first faint rupture. Over the intercom, the voice of his pilot, Captain James Whitmore, is tense. "Tail gunner, cease fire. You're wasting ammo at that range." Donovan's eyes never leave the sights. He speaks calmly into his oxygen mask. "Negative, Captain, watch what happens next." He has fired the first shot. He has broken the rhythm. The initiative, for one fragile moment, is no longer with the hunters. It is with the man in the cursed position at the very end of the bomber who has just decided that today he will not play defense. He will hunt. The tracers from Donovan's opening volley dissipated into the vastness. For 3 long seconds, the world seemed to hang in suspension. The 12 Bf 109s, momentarily scattered like a flock of startled birds, now regrouped. But their formation was looser, their approach more hesitant. The psychological seed had been planted. This bomber, this tail gunner, was not following the script. Donovan tracked the new lead fighter, a veteran likely, pushing his aircraft back into position. The range, 1,400 yards, still too far for guaranteed hits but well within the range of influence. Donovan fired again, not a wild barrage but 2 short, disciplined 3-second bursts. The bullets walked through the airspace just ahead of the formation's nose. The lead pilot jinked, braking hard left. The wingmen, their focus fractured, followed suit. The coordinated attack Donovan had studied in intelligence briefings. A tight echelon pouring concentrated cannon fire into the bomber's vulnerable rear, dissolved before it could even begin. In the cockpit of Hell's Fury, Captain Whitmore watched, his knuckles white on the control yoke. The standard doctrine was clear. Let the gunners engage only when the fighters were fully committed, their flight paths predictable. This was improvisation, and it was burning through their precious ammunition. The crew chief's voice echoed in his memory from the debrief of Donovan's first mission. He fired 16-0 rounds, Captain, 80% of his load. Yet they'd returned without a scratch. One of the BF-109s, perhaps emboldened or enraged by the disruptive fire, broke from the pack. It was the wingman on the far left, diving in a shallow, aggressive angle. A solo artist. Donovan recognized the type, the eager one, the one who thought individualism could triumph over the bomber defensive web. He let this one come. He held his fire as the fighter closed. 1,200 yards, 1,100, 1,000. The optimal defensive range was 600. At 800 yards, with the German's wingspan filling his reflector sight, Donovan squeezed the triggers and held them. This was not a burst. It was a sustained river of lead. 200 rounds poured forth in a relentless, concussive stream. The tracer core became a solid, flaming rope connecting the B-17's tail to the fighter's nose. The BF-109 pilot tried to brake, but he flew directly into the storm. Orange flame erupted from the engine cowling. The canopy vanished in a spray of plexiglass. The sleek fighter seemed to crumple in midair, then cartwheeled away, a comet of smoke and debris spiraling down through 23,000 feet of sky towards the German forest below. Good kill, tail? The radio operator's voice crackled with relief. Donovan didn't acknowledge it. He was already traversing his guns, the hydraulics whining, searching for the next threat. The kill was data. It proved his algebra. One sustained burst of 200 rounds equaled one destroyed fighter. But one destroyed fighter early in the engagement could equal a disrupted attack that saved 10,000 pounds of aircraft and 9 lives. The equation balanced. The remaining 11 fighters, however, were learning. They'd seen their comrade fall to precise, aggressive fire. They would not make the same mistake twice. They broke into 2 distinct groups, executing a classic pincer maneuver. 6 Dove from the direct 6 o'clock position, Donovan's primary sector. The other 5 swung wide to come in from 7 o'clock low, aiming to split his attention and that of the waist gunners. Standard response. Divide fire, try to cover both threats, hope the formation's overlapping fields of fire would save you. Donovan's response was a calculated violation. Waist gunners, you have 7 o'clock. I'm holding 6. His voice was flat, devoid of panic. He would ignore the 5 fighters to his side entirely. He would trust his crewmates, Sergeants Price and Johnson, and bet everything on breaking the main assault. He focused everything on the 6 diving from dead astern. He picked the lead aircraft and fired a short burst. It missed, but the fighter peeled away. He immediately shifted to the new leader, now 500 yards out. Another burst. A flash of sparks along the wing route. The fighter rolled away, smoking. The remaining 4, their cohesion shattered by the loss of 2 leaders in 10 seconds, lost their nerve. They broke formation, not to reposition, but to flee. The direct stern attack had collapsed, but the battle was not over. The 5 fighters from 7 o'clock were now in the killing zone. The chatter of the waist guns filled the intercom. Tracers crisscrossed behind the bomber. Hell's Fury shuddered as 20 cannon shells found their mark somewhere amidships. The acrid smell of cordite seeped into Donovan's position from ahead. He was helpless to assist. His guns pointed the wrong way, his fate now in the hands of others, the very trust he had demanded. The din from the waist guns was a frantic staccato counterpoint to the bomber's steady, laborious roar. Hell's Fury shuddered again, a deep metallic groan resonating through her frame. Donovan heard damage reports crackling over the intercom, superficial hits to the waist, a hydraulic line leaking, but no cries of injury. His fellow gunners were holding. He kept his eyes locked on his 6 o'clock sector, a now empty sky that felt like the calm before a hurricane. The 5 BF-109s from the 7 o'clock attack, thwarted by the concentrated fire of the waist gunners, had pulled away, merging with the original group that now orbited at a wary distance. They were no longer a formation, but a swarm of angry hornets assessing, communicating via radio. Donovan checked his ammunition counter. He'd expended nearly 1,200 rounds. He had 800 left. Enough for perhaps one more sustained engagement. They still had to reach Augsburg, drop their bombs, and run the gauntlet home. Captain Whitmore's voice was tight but controlled. "They're calling in friends. Radar's picking up new contacts. Lots of them. Form up tight, everyone. It's about to get hot." 15 minutes later, the sky to the east darkened, not with clouds but with aircraft. A full grupp, 36 fighters, swept into view, a mix of Bf 109s and heavier, deadlier Focke-Wulf FW 190s. Combined with the 12 still shadowing them, Hell's Fury, now slightly separated from the main bomber stream, faced a staggering 48 enemy aircraft. The mathematics of survival had just collapsed. 48 against 10 guns, and one of those guns, the tail, was already half spent. The new arrivals did not bother with intricate tactics. They fanned out into a vast, encircling net. This was no longer a surgical attack on a bomber. It was an annihilation. They would come from every angle at once, high, low, left, right, overwhelming the defensive fields of fire through sheer volume. The psychological weight of it pressed down on the crew. This was the scenario every man feared. Donovan felt the cold not of altitude, but of final calculation. 380 rounds in his belts, 48 fighters. The numbers screamed defeat, unless he changed the fundamental equation. Captain Donovan's voice cut through the intercom static. "Permission to try something." A pause. "What, Donovan?" "Attack." The silence on the channel was absolute. Then Whitmore, "Explain now." "They're forming up for a coordinated swarm. Give them another minute and they'll hit us from every vector simultaneously. We can't defend against that, but we can disrupt it. If I engage now while they're still organizing, still vulnerable, I can force them to scatter before they're ready." "You'll be out of ammunition in 30 seconds, Whitmore shot back. "Then I better make them count, sir." Donovan's tone was devoid of bravado. It was the cool statement of a technician. "Defensive tactics fail at 20-to-1 odds. Our only chance is aggressive action during their vulnerable phase." In the cockpit, Whitmore looked at his co-pilot, then at the terrifying mosaic of enemy fighters painting his windscreen. The textbook offered no chapter for this. He made a decision born not of doctrine, but of trust forged in 2 previous missions where this reckless tail gunner's math had proven correct. "Do it," Whitmore said, the words heavy. "But if you get us all killed, I'm writing your family a very angry letter." Donovan didn't smile. He swiveled his guns. The German Grupp was 2,000 yards out, a magnificent, terrifying spectacle of aerial power arranging itself into killing lines. Lead elements were establishing attack vectors, trailing elements jockeyed into support positions. It was a moment of perfect, arrogant vulnerability. He took a breath, exhaled half of it, and pressed the triggers. He did not aim at a specific aircraft. He aimed at the center of the formation, at the very idea of its coordination. He poured 200 rounds, a full tenth of his remaining ammunition, into the heart of their gathering storm in one long, 8-second torrent of fire. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. Tracers lanced through the tightly packed airspace. A Bf 109 in the middle of the pack suddenly smoked, then veered into its wingman in a catastrophic midair collision that blossomed into a double fireball. The elegant formation shattered like glass struck by a hammer. 48 fighters became 48 individual pilots executing emergency brakes, climbing, diving, rolling away from each other, and from the unexpected suicidal aggression coming from the bomber they were supposed to destroy. The sky was suddenly a confused kaleidoscope of crossing trails and evading aircraft. "Holy!" Whitmore didn't finish the word. The swarm had been broken before it could sting. But Donovan was already reloading, his hands moving with mechanical precision. He had bought them time, maybe 2 minutes. The Germans would regroup and they would be furious. The next attack would be personal, and he had 180 rounds left to meet it. The reprieve was terrifyingly brief. The scattered German fighters, their pride wounded and their numbers still overwhelming, regrouped with a ferocious speed. 90 seconds. That was all the time Mike Donovan's defiant barrage had purchased. Now, anger replaced coordination. They did not bother reforming complex attack patterns. This would be a swarming, a furball of violence aimed squarely at the tail of the B-17 that had humiliated them. 12 fighters dove from the 6 o'clock position simultaneously. No elegant echelon, no staggered approach. Just a wall of propellers and cannon muzzles filling Donovan's vision. It was a test of sheer volume against his dwindling ammunition. 180 rounds against 12 fighters. His mind cleared of everything but geometry and instinct. He did not target the closest aircraft, nor the one firing first. He targeted the center of the swarm, the psychological anchor of the pack. 3 short, precise 30-round bursts walked through the formation's heart. The first struck a BF-109 in the engine. It coughed black smoke and peeled away. The second shattered the canopy of another. It nosed down, gone. The third hit a wingman. It rolled violently and disappeared from his sight. 3 damaged, 1 probable kill. The remaining 9 came on, undeterred, now within 400 yards. The air around Hell's Fury's tail erupted with the bright, deadly confetti of 20 cannon shells. The sound was no longer individual reports, but a continuous, ripping tier of high explosives. Metal shrieked. A shell tore a fist-sized hole in the plexiglass 3 inches from Donovan's head, the concussion whipping past his ear. The aircraft shuddered like a living thing in pain. Donovan kept firing. Track, squeeze, burst, shift. His movements were robotic, efficient, devoid of the tremor of fear. Another fighter, pressing too close, flew into his stream of tracers. Its right wing sheared off in a cloud of debris, and it spun earthward. Another followed, a direct hit to the fuel tank, transforming it into a momentary sun. 5 left, 200 yards, point-blank range. He could see them now, the dark shapes of the pilots in their cockpits, the iron crosses on the fuselages. Young men, faces set in determined snarls behind oxygen masks. He shot them anyway. 2 more vanished in flames. 3 left. 100 yards. The survivors, the reality of their devastating losses finally penetrating their rage, broke off violently. It was too close. The risk of colliding with the bomber or their own falling comrades now outweighed the kill. Donovan tracked the last, closest fighter as it veered away. He squeezed the trigger. Click. A dry, empty, final sound. The violent roar of his guns ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. He was out, dry on all guns. 180 rounds expended in 45 seconds. 6 fighters destroyed in that single, desperate engagement. "I'm out," he reported, his voice strangely calm over the intercom. "Dry on all guns." "Copy, tail," Whitmore responded, his own voice strained. "Damage report. Everyone sound off." The crew checked in, ball turret damaged but operational, waist section hold but gunners okay, rudder cables frayed but holding. They were bruised, bleeding from minor shrapnel, deafened but alive. Hell's Fury could still fly, but she was now defenseless at her most vulnerable point. The German fighters, licking their wounds, knew it. They regrouped for a 3rd time. 27 aircraft remained from the original 48. They had lost 21 of their own to a single bomber, a catastrophic, unsustainable rate of loss. But they had one final, undeniable advantage. The tail guns were silent. The demon in the rear was disarmed. They formed up for a final executioner's approach. Not a high-speed dive, not a swarming attack. A slow, deliberate, tight formation from directly astern, 6 o'clock low. They came in line abreast, a wall of death taking their time. They knew he couldn't shoot back. This was a coup de grace. Donovan watched them come, 400 yards, 300. He had no ammunition, no way to physically stop them. But he had one weapon left, sharper than steel, psychology. He reached up, grasped the handles of his silent, empty guns, and traversed them smoothly. He aligned the barrels perfectly on the lead fighter in the center of the formation. He followed its approach with textbook precision, his head pressed against the sight, his body language that of a hunter locked on target. In the cockpit of that lead BF-109, the pilot saw the twin muzzles of the 50 cals tracking him with lethal intent. His rational mind knew the American had fired all his rounds, the long burst, the sudden silence. But the reptile brain, the part trained through 100 dogfights, screamed a different message. Those guns are on you. He is going to fire. The memory of the 12 kills, the shattered formations, the comrades falling in flames, overrode logic. The lead pilot jerked his control stick hard right in an instinctive, violent evasion. His wingmen, reacting to his sudden break, followed suit. The perfect execution-style formation disintegrated into a confused scatter. They broke off not because Donovan could shoot, but because, in that critical moment, they believed he would. "They're breaking off," the ball turret gunner whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "They're actually breaking off." And they were. The cost had been too high. The psychological toll was complete. The shadow of the empty guns, amplified by the legend of the man behind them, was enough. The remaining fighters, their morale shattered, turned for home. Hell's Fury flew on, unmolested, toward the smoke-hazed horizon of Augsburg. Hell's Fury landed at Framlingham Airfield at 16:47 hours, her aluminum skin riddled with 47 bullet holes and 13 cannon strikes. One propeller feathered, her rudder patched with emergency tape. She looked less like a victorious fortress and more like a mangled veteran staggering home. As the engines coughed to silence, ground crews swarmed over her, their faces a mix of awe and horror. Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan unclamped himself from the tail gun position. The cramped, frozen muscles of his legs protested as he dropped down through the hatch onto the hard English tarmac. The sudden quiet was jarring, the roar of the mission replaced by the shouted orders of crew chiefs and the distant whine of other B-17s returning. He lit a cigarette, his hands steady, his face betraying no emotion deeper than fatigue. The crew chief, Sergeant Frank Murphy, approached, clipboard in hand. He had already been inside the tail. "You used everything, Donovan," Murphy said, his tone not accusatory but incredulous. 2,000 rounds, every last bullet we loaded." Donovan took a drag, exhaling slowly. "Had to. Didn't have enough to waste any." Captain Whitmore joined them, peeling off his leather flying helmet. "How many did he get?" he asked Murphy. Murphy consulted his notes, compiled from intercom chatter, visual confirms from the waist and ball gunners, and radio intercepts already buzzing from intelligence. "Confirmed kills from our crew and escort fighters who caught up later, 12. He looked up, meeting Whitmore's eye. 4 probables, 3 damaged. That's 19 aircraft engaged in about 4 minutes of actual combat." Whitmore stared at Donovan, the man who had argued with him over the intercom while surrounded by 48 enemy fighters. 12 confirmed kills in a single mission was an aces tally for a fighter pilot spread over a tour. For a tail gunner, it was unheard of, mythical. The story did not spread, it detonated. By evening, it was in the officers' club and the enlisted mess. By morning, tail gunners from across the 390th Bombardment Group were at Donovan's barracks door asking how. By afternoon, pilots and commanders from neighboring groups were requesting a briefing. And by evening, a staff car arrived, carrying a man whose olive-drab uniform bore the silver star of a Major General. Major General Frederick Anderson, commanding officer of the 8th Air Force Bomber Command, found Donovan not in debriefing, but in the enlisted men's barracks, performing the mundane ritual of cleaning his now spotless guns. The sergeant stood at attention. "At ease," Anderson said, his eyes scanning the unassuming man before him. "I've read the report. I've seen the gun camera footage they managed to salvage. Now I want to understand what you did, not the motions." "The thought," Donovan explained, "not with jargon but with the street-smart logic of South Boston. You don't wait for the punch. You throw first. You make the other guy worry about his survival, not yours. You break the plan before it starts." He spoke of seizing initiative, of psychological intimidation, of focused fire, of accepting calculated risk. General Anderson listened, his face unreadable. When Donovan finished, the general asked a single monumental question. "Can you teach this, not to every gunner, but to the right men?" Donovan considered. "Not everyone's got the temperament, sir. You need gunners who think like fighters, who see an opportunity where others see a threat, who'd rather attack than defend." "Find them," Anderson ordered, his decision made. "You're reassigned to training command, effective immediately. Develop a curriculum, select the candidates, transform tail gunner tactics for the entire 8th Air Force." Donovan hesitated. "Sir, I'd prefer to stay with my crew." "Your crew is alive because of what you did," Anderson said, not unkindly but with finality. "Other crews are dying because their gunners don't know what you know. Which is more important, Sergeant? 9 men or 9,000? The answer was a mathematical certainty, a new equation to replace the old one of ammunition and angles. Donovan accepted. He spent the next month in a makeshift classroom near the flight line, developing what would become known as the Donovan Doctrine. The principles were simple, revolutionary heresy against the defensive dogma. Seize initiative, engage during the enemy's formation phase, force them to react to you. Psychological warfare, the first burst is for intimidation, not destruction. Make them cautious, break their coordination. Focus fire. When outnumbered, concentrate on the most dangerous sector. Trust your crew. Ammunition economy through aggression. 30 rounds that scatters a formation is cheaper than 300 rounds fighting a scattered formation. Accept risk. The mission's survival outweighs the individual's. Offensive action decreases collective risk, even if it increases individual exposure. The resistance was fierce. Traditionalists called it reckless suicide. Commanders blanched at the projected ammunition expenditure reports. But Donovan had one irrefutable piece of evidence. He and his crew were alive. And soon, he would have the data to prove it wasn't a fluke. The first class of Donovan's aggressive gunnery program consisted of 30 hand-picked men. They were not necessarily the top marksmen. They were the ones with a certain look in their eye, restless, impatient with protocol, men who had maybe fired early on a previous mission and been reprimanded for it. Donovan's classroom had no chalkboards with complex formulas. It had a stripped-down tail gun assembly, swivel chairs, and a relentless series of questions. A swarm of 4 109s is forming up at 1,500 yards. Standard doctrine says, a student would answer, track, wait for commitment, engage, lead at 600. Donovan would shake his head. Wrong, you open fire now, not to hit, to make the wingman second-guess his leader. Who here's played poker? He'd pace. It's a bluff, a costly bluff if you're wrong, but the pot is your bomber. The live-fire exercises were transformative. Instead of static targets, they used towed sleds that simulated attack profiles. Donovan taught them to fire walking bursts ahead of the target's path, to sense the formation's psychological center, to ignore the tempting, isolated fighter in favor of disrupting the cohesive group. His mantra became doctrine. Fear happens when you react, confidence happens when you act first. But not every candidate could make the psychic leap. Roughly a third washed out, their defensive instincts too deeply ingrained. They couldn't bear the perceived vulnerability of inviting fire, of expending ammunition on what seemed like air. Those who succeeded, however, underwent a conversion. They began to see their position not as a lonely, defensive coffin, but as a pivot point of offensive power. The doctrine's first real-world test came not from Donovan's graduates, but from the spread of his ideas through gossip and grit. Gunners who had heard the story of March 6th began, tentatively, to experiment. A burst at 1,000 yards here, a focus on a formation center there. The results were initially isolated but telling. Crews reported German attacks breaking up earlier with less precision. Then the data began to aggregate at 8th Air Force headquarters. The statisticians and operations analysts, men who dealt in cold numbers, started to see a correlation that became a causation. In March 1944, before Donovan's mission, the tail gunner casualty rate stood at a grim 38%. By mid-May, as his teachings circulated, it had dropped to 29%. German fighter attack completion rates, the percentage of planned attacks that pressed home to effective range, plummeted from 52% to 35%. The bombers employing aggressive defense were getting hit less often, and their gunners were dying at a lower rate. The ultimate validation came from the enemy. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park and 8th Air Force Intelligence began intercepting and translating Luftwaffe after-action reports and pilot advisories. One, dated June 1944, was particularly telling. American tail gunners have adopted new, highly disruptive tactics. They engage with sustained fire during our formation approach, preventing coordinated attack. Recommend avoiding direct stern approaches against formations displaying this behavior. Prioritize targets of opportunity elsewhere. The psychological reversal was complete. German pilots, once the hunters who dictated terms, were now being advised to avoid bombers whose gunners displayed a certain aggression. The Donovan Doctrine was achieving its ultimate goal, not just killing fighters, but deterring attacks altogether. Donovan's own students, unleashed upon the skies of Europe, began to build legends of their own. Sergeant Thomas, Tommy Bailey, a quiet farm boy from Iowa with preternatural calm, destroyed 6 fighters in 2 missions using Donovan's focus fire principle. Sergeant Robert Chen, who'd studied engineering, devised a simple, improved traverse mechanism for his guns that allowed even faster tracking. He completed 27 missions without a single cannon hit to his tail position. The doctrine was evolving, adapting, being refined in the crucible of combat by the men Donovan had trained. Back in the training hut, Donovan presented the hard numbers to skeptical visiting officers. He showed them the casualty graphs, the attack completion percentages, the translated German advisories. It's not about being a better shot, he'd conclude. It's about being a harder target to approach. You don't win a fight by blocking punches better. You win by making the other guy afraid to throw one. The math, cold and irrefutable, was proving the street fighter from South Boston correct. Survival was not a function of hiding. It was a function of imposing your will. By the summer of 1944, the Donovan Doctrine was no longer an experiment. It was a contagion of confidence sweeping through the bomber streams of the 8th Air Force. It spread beyond tail gunners. Waist gunners, understanding the principle of focused fire, began coordinating their bursts to create lethal, crossing zones that made any attack angle dangerous. Ball turret gunners, the men hanging beneath the fortress in their spherical prisons, adopted aggressive tracking, challenging fighters that thought they were safe below. The effect was cumulative and catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. A bomber formation was no longer a collection of 10 isolated defensive positions, but an interconnected, prickly sphere of aggression. German fighter pilots, already strained by fuel shortages, losing veteran leaders and facing ever-improving Allied escorts, now faced a new, demoralizing calculus. The cost of attacking a fortress or liberator had skyrocketed. The easy kills among the bomber streams were disappearing. Internal 8th Air Force analysis, conducted in August 1944, delivered the stark numbers. Average bomber losses per 1,000 sorties had fallen from 14 in the early spring to just 8. A 43% reduction. The report cited multiple factors: the dominance of the P-51 Mustang escort, the destruction of German fuel production, but it attributed a significant 28% of the improvement directly to enhanced defensive gunnery tactics and the resultant degradation of enemy fighter effectiveness and morale. Captured German documents after the war painted an even clearer picture of the doctrine's impact. A Luftwaffe training memorandum from July 1944 lamented, "The psychological effect of the American Abwehrführer, defensive fire, is often more damaging than its material effect. Gunners now fire predictably at our formations, disrupting timing and forcing individual pilots to break early. This eliminates the concentration of fire necessary for success. Attack discipline has deteriorated. The sky had fundamentally changed. Where once a staffel of Bf 109s could approach a bomber box with disciplined, predatory confidence, they now approached with wary trepidation, watching for the early, telltale flicker of tracers from the tail position, the signature of a Donovan-trained gunner. That signature became a deterrent as potent as a squadron of escort fighters. Radio intercepts often heard German flight leaders calling out warnings. Achtung, aggressiver Heckenschütze. Attention, aggressive tail gunner. The warning alone could cause an attack to be aborted. Donovan, grounded at his training desk, received these reports as dry, typed summaries. He saw the statistics, the graphs trending downward. He interviewed returning gunners not as their commander, but as a fellow craftsman, debriefing what worked, what didn't, refining the doctrine. He never celebrated the numbers. To him, they were simply proof that his algebra of aggression, the equation where proactive violence canceled out greater threat, was correct on a grand scale. His personal war had ended in those 4 minutes over Germany. The man who had rewritten the rules would not fire another shot in anger. He found his purpose in the faces of the men who came through his hut. The scared ones he calmed, the angry ones he focused, the talented ones he sharpened. He taught them that their greatest weapon was not the .50 caliber Browning, but the decision to use it first. He gave them permission to trust their aggression, to see their defensive position as an offensive opportunity. One of his graduates, a lanky gunner from Oklahoma named Sergeant David Miller, put it best in a letter home, later shared with Donovan. "It's like the instructor says, Ma, it's not about hiding in your foxhole hoping they miss. It's about standing up, throwing a grenade into theirs, and making them keep their heads down. This guy Donovan, he ain't some West Point general. He's just a guy who figured out that in the sky, the best defense is a real good, loud offense." The doctrine had taken on a life of its own, evolving beyond its creator. It proved that in the vast, anonymous calculus of total war, the will of a single individual, codified and transmitted, could bend the curve of history. The sky above Europe, once a killing field for bomber crews, was becoming a more hostile environment for the hunters. And it all traced back to one man's refusal to wait for death in a cursed position at the tail of a B-17 named Hell's Fury. The war ground on to its thunderous conclusion. The bombers of the 8th Air Force pounded Germany into rubble. The men Donovan trained completed their tour, some with remarkable kill tallies, most with the quieter victory of simply surviving. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the analysis began in earnest. The final numbers cemented the legacy of that single mission on March 6th. Conservative estimates, compiled by the Air Force Historical Division, credited the widespread adoption of aggressive tail gunner tactics, with directly saving approximately 300 B-17s and B-24s that would have been lost under the old defensive doctrine. That translated to roughly 3,000 airmen who returned home. Men who would have otherwise become names on missing aircrew reports, letters of condolence, and graves in Cambridge or fields in Belgium. Michael Donovan was discharged in late 1945. He returned to South Boston, not as a war hero. The Distinguished Service Cross he received was tucked away in a drawer, but as Michael Donovan, construction worker. He married a local girl named Margaret, fathered 3 children, and spoke little of the war. The vast, strategic impact of his actions was unknown to him. He knew only that he'd done a job and then taught others to do it. When journalists, spurred by the publishing of unit histories in the 1960s, tracked him down to a modest row house, he politely declined interviews. "I did what needed doing," he'd say, ending the conversation. "So did 300 other gunners. They're the real story." He saw himself not as an architect of doctrine, but as one tradesman passing a better tool to the next. One of those gunners, Thomas Bailey, the one who'd scored 16 kills, disagreed. In a 1972 interview for an oral history project, the aging veteran was adamant. "Before Donovan, we thought like victims. We waited. We conserved. We hoped. Mike taught us to think like predators. Survival ain't about making yourself a small target. It's about making the enemy see you as a big, dangerous one." Sounds simple. It changes everything. Donovan's funeral in 1998 was a small, quiet affair at St. Augustine Cemetery. 17 people attended, family, a few neighbors, 2 old war buddies who'd served with him before he went to training command. There was no military honor guard, no flyover, no mention from the local paper beyond a standard obituary that listed his DSC without context. The priest, who knew him as a quiet parishioner, spoke of a faithful husband and father. He knew nothing of Augsburg, of 12 kills in 4 minutes, of the Donovan doctrine. But that same night, in a weathered VFW hall in South Boston, a different gathering took place. They came from across the country, men now in their 70s with frail bodies but eyes that still held the sharpness of men who had watched the sky. Thomas Bailey was there. Robert Chen flew in from California. A dozen others, graduates of those early, intense classes in the spring of '44. They raised their glasses of whiskey in the dim light. Bailey, his voice rough with age and emotion, gave the toast. To Mike, he never thought he was special. Just a guy doing his job, trying to keep his crew alive. But his job saved 3,000 of us. Every bomber that made it home because some Luftwaffe hotshot got spooked by an early burst. Every gunner who lived through his 25 because he learned to shoot first and ask questions later. Every factory that got bombed because the fighters were too busy running. That's Mike's legacy, not 12 kills. 12,000 lives. They drank in silence, the weight of the number hanging in the air. It was an estimation, of course, a ripple effect through history. But in that room, it was a truth as tangible as the medals in their cases at home. The principles Donovan codified in that English training hut did not die with the B-17. They were studied, formalized, and integrated into post-war aerial combat doctrine by the United States, Great Britain, and even in secret by the Soviet Union. Modern manuals for aircrew survival, for helicopter door gunners, for a C-130 gunship operators, all contain the echo of his logic. Seize the initiative, control the psychology of the engagement, aggression as a form of defense. In the end, Michael "Mad Mike" Donovan was proven right by the coldest, most enduring judge, history's ledger. His personal war was a brief, 4-minute cataclysm of violence. His lasting victory was measured in silence. The silence of guns that never had to fire because the enemy chose not to come. The silence of empty chairs at dinner tables that were instead filled. The silence of a peaceful sky where once there was only the scream of engines and the deadly chatter of guns. The true measure of Michael Donovan's impact lies not in the fiery anecdotes, but in the sterile, precise language of after-action reports and tactical manuals. The Donovan doctrine transcended the man, becoming a formalized component of U.S. Air Force gunnery training. Its principles, initiative, psychological disruption, focused aggression, were stripped of their South Boston origins and encoded into curriculum. Post-war analysts, with access to both Allied and captured German records, performed the final audit. The numbers were stark. The implementation of aggressive tail gunner tactics in the second half of 1944 correlated with a 63% decline in German fighter effectiveness against bomber formations, as measured by bombers lost per fighter sortie. While factors like escort range and fuel shortages played major roles, The analysts assigned a 28% causative factor to the new gunnery methods. German pilots, the reports concluded, were not just being shot down more often. They were being deterred from engaging effectively, their tactical playbook forcibly rewritten by the unpredictable aggression from the bombers themselves. This was Donovan's algebra proven on a strategic scale. Early aggression plus psychological pressure equals reduced engagement will. The equation balanced. The resource saved was not just ammunition, but the most precious resource of all, the willingness of the enemy to fight. The doctrine leaked into other domains. In Korea, helicopter pilots flying vulnerable medevac missions used, Donovan-style, preemptive door gunner fire to suppress enemy positions on landing zones. In Vietnam, a C-130 Spectre gunship crews, orbiting in predictable patterns, employed intense, anticipatory fire to break up Viet Cong assaults before they could be launched against them. The core idea remained: dominate the enemy's decision-making cycle, make inaction seem safer than action. Even in the age of missiles and stealth, the ghost of the doctrine persists. Modern fighter pilot training for defensive counter-air scenarios emphasizes first look, first kill aggression to break enemy missile locks and attack patterns. The psychological component, the maneuver for moral advantage, is a direct descendant of Donovan's tracers walking through a formation's heart. It is the understanding that combat in any arena is a contest of wills as much as a contest of weapons. And yet, the man at the source of this ripple remained detached from his own legacy. In his Boston home, the war was a closed box. He did not attend reunions of the 390th Bomb Group. He did not read the unit histories where his name appeared. When his children asked, he gave them the simplified version. I was a tail gunner. I did my job. The algebra of survival, so clear at 23,000 feet, was reduced to a personal arithmetic of providing for a family, fixing a leaky roof, living a quiet life. The dichotomy is profound. The most influential tail gunner in history, a man who altered tactical doctrine and saved thousands, lived and died in obscurity by choice. His name is not on famous monuments, but it is etched in the procedural language of training manuals. His memorial is not in stone, but in the instinct of every gunner who was taught to track a threat zone instead of a single target, to value disruption over precision, to understand that the best defense is a good, loud, and early offense. The story of March 6, 1944 is often told as a tale of unbelievable heroism, one man against impossible odds. But to military theorists, it is something more valuable, a case study. It is a clear, documented instance where a single individual's tactical innovation was identified, codified, disseminated, and statistically verified to have changed the outcome of a campaign. It is a testament to the fact that in the mechanized, anonymous horror of total war, the human element, ingenuity, courage, the will to act, could still pivot the course of events. Donovan's final lesson, perhaps, was this: doctrine is not scripture. It is a tool, born in desperation, refined in blood, and validated in the silent spaces where the enemy decides not to fight. He proved that the rules of engagement are written not just by generals in war rooms, but by sergeants in frozen tail positions who dare to think differently while the world explodes around them. March 6, 1944, lasted 4 minutes in the combat log. In those 240 seconds, a single man, isolated in the most vulnerable position on a B-17, rewrote a chapter of aerial warfare. Michael Donovan fired 2,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. He claimed 12 confirmed kills, a tally that would make a fighter pilot an ace twice over. His actions directly saved his crew, his aircraft, and created a psychological shockwave that would reverberate through the rest of the air war in Europe. But the final tally of that day extends far beyond the smoke trails over Germany. It is measured in the 300 B-17 and B-24 bombers that analysts estimate returned to base because German fighters, facing the new aggressive doctrine, broke off their attacks or avoided engagement altogether. It is measured in the roughly 3,000 airmen, pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, engineers, radio operators, waist gunners, ball turret gunners, who walked away from those 300 aircraft, who went on to live full lives, raise families, build careers, grow old. Men who owed their futures to a tactical revolution sparked in the tail of hell's fury. It is measured in the 15% reduction in tail gunner casualty rates within 3 months of the doctrine's adoption, a statistic that represents hundreds of individual sons, brothers and husbands who survived their tour. It is measured in the translated German advisories and the frustration in Luftwaffe after-action reports, the clear evidence of an enemy psychologically defeated, their offensive spirit broken by gunners who refuse to be passive targets. And ultimately, it is measured in the enduring principle, now embedded in the DNA of combat aviation across the world, that true defense is not passive reaction, but controlled, decisive, and often preemptive aggression. The story of Mad Mike Donovan is not one of a flawless hero. It is the story of a man with a street fighter's instincts, a gambler's nerve, and a technician's mind, who found himself in the crucible of the deadliest campaign in the air and saw a flaw in the logic of survival. He was not the perfect soldier by the book. He was the soldier who realized the book was wrong. His legacy is not just in the past. It is in the training a helicopter door gunner receives before a low-level insertion, in the defensive protocols of a modern gunship, in the fighter pilot's mantra of "own the fight." It is in the understanding that courage is not just the ability to endure punishment, but the will to inflict it first to avoid punishment altogether. He returned from the war, shed his uniform, and became a quiet man. The roar of the wind, the chatter of guns, the screams of stressed metal, he left them all at 23,000 feet. He chose obscurity, letting his actions speak through the men he trained and the lives he saved, a silent echo in the data of historians and the procedures of pilots. We tell these stories not to glorify war, but to excavate from its darkness the profound truths about human ingenuity and will. We tell them to remember that history is often shaped not just by generals and politicians, but by the decisions of individuals in impossible situations. Michael Donovan made a decision in 4 minutes that echoed for decades. He looked at a cursed position and saw a throne. He looked at 12 enemy fighters and saw a target-rich environment. He looked at certain defensive doctrine and saw a suicide note. And so, he wrote his own.